On October 15, 2016, the 43,000-ton Russian aircraft carrier Admiral Kuznetsov slipped out of the Kola Bay fjord in the Barents Sea. Escorted by a small flotilla of warships, including the powerful Pyotr Velikiy battlecruiser, the carrier sailed through the North Sea and down the English Channel into the Atlantic, before rounding the Iberian Peninsula and entering the Mediterranean and Aegean Seas. A month after leaving Kola Bay, aircraft of the Kuznetsov began operations against Islamic State and Al-Nusra terrorist groups in Syria, in support of the Assad government. This was the first time a Russian carrier group had undertaken a combat deployment, and was the end of a long, complex, and at times troubled road undertaken by Moscow to produce a carrier force which was hoped to one day challenge the dominance of the United States Navy. A dream that once offered great promise, but as of 2023 sees one solitary carrier rusting and leaking in a Russian shipyard, waiting for the government to release funds to finish repairs to make it operational once again. This is the story of the Soviet Navy's carrier program, its origins, its highs and lows, and the fruit it bore both for Russia and for others in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse. Welcome to Wars of the World. On September 2, 1945, the Imperial Japanese Empire formally surrendered to the Allies, bringing an end to World War II. The Pacific theater of the war especially saw the aircraft carrier finally displace the battleship as the primary naval asset. Mighty warships which would have dominated the seas just 15 years earlier were savaged by the relatively inexpensive yet extremely powerful aircraft of the carrier groups. But carrier air power was more than just an extension of the battle group's firepower. Aircraft carriers were equally effective in influencing the battles on land, providing support to ground troops, and even carrying out limited strategic bombing campaigns alongside the heavy bombers of the USAAF. America, Australia, Britain, France, and Holland, among others, all recognized the importance of carrier power in the immediate post-war period, as they switched their focus from defeating the Axis to maintaining their global influence and supporting the restructuring of the post-war world. However, for the Soviet Union, the strategic situation was a little different. Compared to the immense battles which took place on land on the Eastern Front, the Soviet war at sea was more of a sideshow, since the Soviet Union had no sea barrier between it and Nazi Germany, as well as sharing a border with Japanese-occupied continental Asia in the east. In the wake of the October 1917 revolution and the subsequent Russian Civil War which saw the birth of the Soviet Union, the new Soviet Navy, initially known as the Red Navy, inherited a number of warships from the days of the Tsar, including battleships, but the Soviets were far quicker than their Western counterparts to realize the days of such larger ships were numbered. Submarines were especially dangerous to the mammoth battleships, and as such, the Soviet naval construction program focused on destroyers and cruisers. However, this is not to say the Soviets never toyed with the idea of an aircraft carrier. As early as 1925, there were serious proposals being considered, the most promising of which was the conversion of an unfinished Borodino-class battlecruiser, the Ismail, into an aircraft carrier which would be capable of operating 50 aircraft. Despite there being strong support politically, the Soviet army opposed the plan, wanting the money and resources diverted to them instead, and after they gained influence within a commission set up to evaluate the Navy's needs, they succeeded in getting the plan cancelled in March 1926. More plans for carriers were conceived in the years leading up to World War II, but they were all left by the wayside. The problem was that despite its size, the Soviet Union could not afford to fund a powerful navy equivalent to its Western rivals, as well as building a powerful army. One of them had to be prioritized over the other, and the winner was the army. After World War II ended, the Soviet Union was still under the grip of paranoid Joseph Stalin, who now prepared for what he viewed as the next war, which he foresaw as an American-led invasion against his country. He therefore instituted a major rearmament program, which naval staff saw as an opportunity to finally build up their fleet, including aircraft carriers which would challenge the dominant US and Royal Navies. They ambitiously conceived of a force of 15 carriers, 9 large and 6 small, split between the Pacific and Northern fleets, with 6 of the large carriers allocated to the Pacific and the rest allocated to the Northern fleet. The plans were getting underway and included a prototype naval warplane in the form of the ungainly Tupolev Tu-91. Then, on March 5, 1953, Stalin died. Under new Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, such ambitious plans for large conventional naval forces lost their priority. Khrushchev instead viewed missiles and rocketry as being the key to military dominance at sea, and so the Soviet Navy became increasingly tailored towards submarines and missile-armed surface ships. However, it was the importance of countering the West's submarines which would actually lead to the Soviets finally building their first carriers of a sort. One of the biggest obstacles for the Soviet Navy, should hostilities break out with the West and Europe during the Cold War, was the location of their main bases, which could easily be blockaded by NATO attack submarines. This was a large concern for the Soviet ballistic missile submarine fleet in the early days, since they would have to bypass NATO's northern flank and travel through the Greenland, Iceland and UK gap to get their missiles within range of the United States' east coast. As such, in 1959, proposals were put forward for a powerful new warship with a large complement of helicopters which would hunt down NATO attack submarines and American, British and French ballistic missile submarines. The new vessel would not only act as flagship for an anti-submarine flotilla, but would itself possess formidable firepower for defense. Originally, it was intended that the new ship would be in the region of 8,000 tons. But as the design was reworked again and again, this swelled to over double that figure. It is reported by some sources that as many as 12 ships were planned, but in the end only 3 ships were laid down, and even then only 2 would enter service, beginning with the Moskva in 1967, from which the class takes its name, followed by the Leningrad in 1969. At first glance, these warships looked like a hybrid between a missile cruiser and an aircraft carrier. Separated by the main superstructure, the rear section of the ships featured a large flight deck and support facilities to operate its air wing of 12 to 14 helicopters, while the bow section resembled a modern, heavily armed missile cruiser. Perhaps just as unique looking as the 2 ships themselves was their air wing of Kamov Ka-25 helicopters. Unlike the vast majority of helicopters in the West, which featured a tail rotor, the Ka-25 instead had 2 main rotors mounted on top of one another, spinning in opposite directions. This had several advantages over the Western helicopters with a similar role, such as the US Navy's Kaman SH-2 Sea Sprite, but most crucially for use on a warship where space is at a premium, it allowed for a smaller aircraft to be built. A powerful search radar was housed in the bulbous chin radome to detect ships, while a dipping sonar magnetic anomaly detector and a bank of sonar buoys could be used to find submarines. Armament included torpedoes and depth charges, which if necessary could be equipped with nuclear warheads, and these were backed up by the Moskva class's own weapons. On paper, it seemed as though the Soviets had built a powerful anti-submarine weapon. However, a number of problems were revealed through the operation of the vessels, the most serious of which for its air wing was that there were very poor sea keepers. This meant that pilots landing and taking off from the 2 ships had to frequently contend with a pitching deck in all but the calmest of weather, a dangerous proposition for even the most skilled of aviators. At the time of their construction, naval engineering was undergoing a revolution in the replacement of steam and oil-burning engines, with the newer gas turbine engines, which offered more power and were able to reach full power much quicker. However, Soviet engineers had yet to try the new power plants in such a large vessel as these, especially ones with such an important mission, and so they erred on the side of caution and chose to propel the 2 Moskvas with high-pressure steam engines, producing an estimated 100,000 horsepower. Unfortunately, these steam engines failed to live up to expectations in terms of performance, with a maximum speed being only 30 knots or 35 miles per hour, although this was comparable to American and British cruisers of the day. It was ultimately a lack of reliability that these steam engines would give the Soviet Navy their biggest headaches. Mechanical breakdowns were especially common aboard the Moskva, the most serious of which resulted in a fire in 1973, which necessitated the engines to be rebuilt. But perhaps the biggest issue for the vessels was in their ability to actually perform their role, even when things were going well under ideal conditions. Despite the size of its air wing, it could only operate around 4 helicopters at any one time, limiting its ability to provide an effective anti-submarine screen. Adding to the ship's problems was that the US Navy was soon to introduce their new Polaris missiles for their submarines. These missiles would give even longer range to their submarines, being able to fire further from the Soviet shoreline. This would mean that in order to hunt them down, the Moskvas would have to venture out further out to sea, beyond the assistance of Soviet land-based air and coastal defenses. Here out at sea, they would come under heavy NATO attack from both the air and the sea. The Moskva class even demonstrated inadequacies with escort ships. Shortly after being commissioned in 1969, Leningrad was sailing with several escorts from the Black Sea to join the Soviet Navy's Northern Fleet. Directly in its path was the British nuclear attack submarine HMS Warspite. Warspite was then under the command of John Sandy Woodward, who would later gain fame as one of the key British commanders during the Falklands War. Silently and secretly, Warspite successfully managed to sail directly under the Leningrad and remain there for several hours to gather key intelligence data before finally being detected by an escort ship. Even then, Warspite was able to successfully evade Soviet pursuit and continued to shadow the Soviet ships for days, monitoring them as they conducted training, and in doing so revealing their tactics to the British, who then shared the data with NATO. Had Warspite been ordered to sink the Leningrad, it could have done so without ever being detected, although it must be pointed out that the whole exercise took place in peacetime, and involved an experienced British submarine crew, while the Leningrad was a new vessel with a relatively new crew. After these factors were realized by the Soviet Admiralty, work on a third Moskva-class vessel, the Kiev, was immediately halted, and development began on a new class of ship intended to address its failings. Meanwhile, Moskva and Leningrad continued their service, and led very busy lives conducting numerous cruises around the world to nations sympathetic to the Soviet Union, in both Africa and the Middle East, where their large size and heavy armament generated a positive impression. Leningrad was also involved in the rescue of the notoriously unlucky K-9 submarine, which suffered a serious fire on February 24, 1972. This was nearly 11 years after its previous incident, in which its reactor came close to a meltdown due to a loss of coolant, and which resulted in the death of 22 of its crew members. In the 1950s and 60s, military leaders on both sides of the Iron Curtain became concerned over the vulnerability of their respected airfields should the other side launch a sudden surprise attack. Runways were huge, immovable targets that, if they were taken out, could trap large numbers of aircraft on the ground, or leave flights of aircraft with nowhere to land, forcing their pilots to bail out and the aircraft to be lost. This became such a concern that the race was on to develop a combat aircraft which could take off and land vertically or in an extremely short distance. In the late 1960s, British engineers produced the first of the Harrier family of combat aircraft, which were capable of taking off and landing vertically by vectoring its engine thrust downwards around its center of gravity. While performance in the air was generally inferior to other combat aircraft, military planners assumed that on the second day of a World War III, it would likely be the only combat aircraft still flying after all the other aircraft bases had been destroyed. Despite this, only the British Royal Air Force, the Spanish Navy, and the United States Marine Corps invested significantly in the Harrier at the time. The Soviets, meanwhile, arguably pursued the concept of vertical takeoff and landing, or VTOL, much more aggressively, even adapting conventional designs currently in service, such as the MiG-21 and MiG-23, for vertical takeoff by equipping them with lift jets. Many of these efforts produced nothing more than a technical curiosity, since they resulted in aircraft with significantly reduced performance. But in 1967, the Yakovlev Design Bureau unveiled a dedicated VTOL technology demonstrator, designated the Yak-36. Just like the Harrier, this worked by vectoring its thrust downwards for vertical takeoff and landing. The Soviet Air Force showed little interest in the aircraft, since it lacked a useful range and offensive payload, but the Soviet Navy were more enthusiastic, recognizing the potential of having a VTOL combat aircraft on the confined decks of their ships. The Yakovlev Design Bureau returned to the drawing board and began designing a new aircraft for use by the Navy, the result of which was the Yak-36M, which despite sharing the Yak-36's designation, was a wholly new aircraft. Looking at the Yak-36M, it would be easy to mistake it for the British Harrier jet, yet it adopted a completely different method of vertical takeoff and landing. The Yak-36M was powered by a single Tumansky R-28 engine, which projected its thrust aft via two nozzles in the rear fuselage. These nozzles rotated downwards during VTOL and worked in conjunction with two small Rybinsk RD-38 lift jets located in tandem behind the cockpit. Working together, they could lift and lower the aircraft vertically. Once airborne, the R-28 would vector its thrust aftwards for normal flight, while the lift jets would power down, this of course having the undesirable effect of becoming dead weight the aircraft would have to carry throughout its flight, until it was time for landing, when they could then be reactivated. First flying in 1971, NATO soon applied the reporting name Forger to identify it, and a year later the aircraft made a successful landing on the deck of the Moskva, becoming the first Soviet VTOL fighter to land on a ship at sea. Test pilot Mikhail Dekspach underwent training in a K-25 helicopter on how to approach the helicopter carrier leading up to the landing, while the deck itself had to be protected from the hot gases thrust downwards by the Yak-36M as it landed and took off again. The Yak-36M was also trialled by landing on platforms fitted to cargo ships, creating makeshift carriers, while some undertook forward developments into the Eastern European countryside, being concealed in dense woodland and taking off from rough, semi-prepared strips to provide close air support for Soviet troops, in a similar fashion to how the Britain's Royal Air Force employed the Harrier in West Germany and Norway. Testing of the Yak-36M led to further improvements, and this resulted in the Yak-38 production variant, known to NATO by the codename Forger A. Just like the British with the Harrier, Soviet engineers realized that the unique operation of the Yak-38 required a dedicated trainer, resulting in the Yak-38U, a two-seater trainer which many pilots agreed could only barely fly and was a contender for one of the ugliest aircraft ever built. Such was the perceived danger of VTOL operations that the Yak-38 featured an automatic ejection system for the pilot, should it detect certain conditions. However, this resulted in several pilots suddenly finding themselves shot out of their aircraft for no apparent reason until it was corrected. Meanwhile, work began on the new ships that, as well as carrying the Kar-25 anti-submarine helicopter, would now also carry the Yak-38. The new vessels, dubbed the Kiev class, resembled more of what an aircraft carrier should look like, with a large flight deck, an island housing the bridge to starboard, and even an angled flight deck protruding out to port. However, closer inspection of the foredeck revealed that this was still an evolution of the Moskva-class concept, with the vessel possessing a large and powerful array of weapons. These included 8 P-500 Basalt supersonic anti-ship missiles, designed for engaging American carriers, and could each be armed with a nuclear warhead, with a blast yields of 305 kilotons, almost 20 times that of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. This may seem odd at first, when considering that American supercarriers and even British Harrier carriers such as the Invincible class were only armed with defensive weaponry, with their aircraft representing their main offensive punch. Such heavy firepower aboard the Kievs instead reflected the limitations of the Yak-38, and the ship's subsequent operation doctrines that these limitations necessitated. The Yak-38 was slow, clumsy, short-ranged, carried a limited payload, and was notoriously unreliable. Reportedly, some pilots were so frustrated or even fearful of the aircraft that they took to calling in sick rather than fly it. As such, it could not truly be used in the same capacity as American naval aircraft, or even the broadly equivalent British Sea Harrier, which had evolved into a potent warplane by the 1980s. Instead, The Yak-38 became an extension of the Kiev's own weapons, representing the outermost tier of a multi-tiered weapon package. The Yak-38 had just enough weapons and range to attack a lumbering NATO maritime patrol aircraft, such as the American P-3 Orion, which could monitor the Soviet fleet just outside the range of the Kiev's surface-to-air missile battery. Alternatively, it could use guns and rockets against fast attack boats, but should the Kiev and its escort ships go up against dedicated naval fighters, such as the US Navy's F-14 Tomcat, or large surface warships, then the Yak-38 would likely be left strapped to the deck, while the Kiev's own weapons engaged them. It is probably for this reason that the Soviet Union still did not consider these vessels true aircraft carriers. Instead, the Kiev class were designated as heavy aviation cruisers, which additionally helped them bypass a 1936 agreement with Turkey, which prevented aircraft carriers from sailing through the Turkish Straits, which they would have to transit if they wished to leave their shipyard on the Black Sea. 4 Kiev-class ships were built at the number 444 shipyard in Ukraine between 1970 and 1987, with the second 2, the Novorossiysk and the Baku, being built with a slightly revised main armament. The 4 ships were still predominantly used to protect Soviet ballistic missile operations and to hunt down NATO submarines with its helicopters, but they were more capable of conducting anti-air and anti-surface operations than the previous Moskva class. Like the Moskvas, they saw extensive service visiting friendly ports and saw several cruises around Africa and Asia, while they were frequent visitors to the Mediterranean and North Atlantic, reminding NATO that they did not hold a monopoly on the seas. They were also used to develop tactics with which to counter NATO amphibious operations by simulating American carriers conducting amphibious assault operations. As for the Yak-38, the experience gained during this time led to the development of the definitive Yak-38M variant in 1985, which, while still a poor performer, was at least an improvement. Like the Harrier in the West, Soviet pilots found that if they conducted a short run down the deck before lifting off, then it used less fuel than would be used during a full vertical takeoff. At this point, it would be easy to dismiss the Yak-38 as a failure, but this is not entirely true. Yes, its tactical use was limited, but it offered the Soviet Navy a wealth of experience in operating a VTOL fighter, which laid the groundwork for a more advanced aircraft planned in the future. That aircraft was expected to be the Yakovlev Yak-41M, a natural evolution of the Yak-38 concept, with a swiveling nozzle on the main engine and a pair of lift jets behind the cockpit. The Yak-41M, known as the Yak-141 outside of the Soviet Union, was a more rounded and infinitely more capable warplane, being equivalent to conventional land-based Soviet types such as the MiG-29, but offering the benefits of VTOL capability. By developing this aircraft, the operation of the Kievs could be completely revolutionized, giving them a much wider operational scope. It was even suggested to have all the forward weapons removed to increase the flight deck space and finally give the Soviet Navy a true aircraft carrier. The Yak-41M first flew in 1987, by which time the whole use of VTOL aircraft in the Soviet Navy was beginning to be questioned. Not only was a more amphibious project getting underway, but political storm clouds were forming on the horizon, which threatened the Soviet Union itself. Even as the Kievs were entering service in the second half of the 1970s, there were those in the Soviet leadership who wanted to get serious about building a true aircraft carrier, akin to those of the US Navy. The Soviets had observed how crucial a role the American carriers had played in the Korean and Vietnam wars, and they began to recognize the usefulness of having these ships to project Soviet power and influence abroad, particularly where friendly airfields were few and far between. There was also the matter of prestige. With their carriers, the Americans frequently demonstrated their global reach, proving they were a superpower, capable of projecting American foreign policy across the world, whereas the Soviet Union had been more focused on the land, where they already had influence. The need to address this balance gained more support by the 1980s, when relations with the West began to deteriorate significantly following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Soviet engineers began putting forward proposals for a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, displacing in excess of 60,000 tons, and utilizing steam catapults and arrestor wires, just like their US carrier equivalents. In terms of aircraft, the Soviets planned to modify a number of their land-based aircraft, such as the Sukhoi Su-25 and the MiG-23, to operate from its decks, while the next generation Su-27 and MiG-29 were in development, which would replace them further down the line. These plans failed to materialize into reality, however, largely down to their cost. It was not just the expense of building the ship itself, but actually building the facilities with which to support the ship. These combined proved completely prohibitive. Instead, the design was reworked, becoming smaller although still larger than the Kiev's, and dispensing with nuclear power, instead being propelled by traditional steam turbines. Additionally, the steam catapults were dropped, and instead a ramp was placed on the bow of the ship. The new ship's aircraft would be held in place by small blocks called detents as they built up power. These blocks would then release the aircraft, and it would make a short run down the deck and up the ramp, which would help hurl it into the air. Landing on the ship was the same as in the West, with the aircraft approaching the angled flight deck and using a tailhook to capture the arrestor wires, which would bring the aircraft to a stop. The whole process was known as stow-bar, meaning short takeoff but arrested recovery, and it had some advantages over the catapults used on the American ships. For one thing, aircraft could begin launching at any time without having to wait for the catapult to power up. Therefore, there was also no risk of a catapult malfunctioning, preventing an aircraft from taking off, or worse, not providing enough power to get an aircraft airborne, causing it to fall into the sea. However, the drawback of this method was that the Russian aircraft wouldn't be able to carry as heavy a payload as American planes, which was fine if they were only armed with missiles for air-to-air combat, defending the fleet from enemy warplanes, but it was limiting in an offensive role. This also meant that only one aircraft could be launched at one time, whereas on US carriers, 2 or even more could be launched in quick succession. Work on the new 43,000-ton carrier began on April 1st, 1982, again at Soviet shipyard number 444 in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the Mikoyan and Sukhoi design bureaus began work on adapting their new MiG-29 and Sukhoi Su-27 fighter aircraft to serve on the new ship. The aircraft, particularly their landing gear, had to be reinforced to survive repeated violent landings on the new ship's deck, while more powerful engines had to be developed to help get them airborne off the short deck and ramp. They were also modified with folding wings so that they could be stored more easily below deck when not in use. Both aircraft received K designations, becoming the MiG-29K and the Su-27K. Takeoff trials were then conducted using a replica ski jump built at the Aviation Research and Training Complex in the Crimea, proving that the concept worked. The new carrier was named Riga after the capital of Latvia, still a Soviet republic at that time, but it was later changed to Leonid Brezhnev in honor of the recently deceased Soviet premier. But it was again changed, this time to Tbilisi, the capital of the Soviet Republic of Georgia. Work on the carrier was slow and protracted, and by 1989, the ship was approximately 71% complete when it went to sea to begin takeoff and landing trials of its aircraft. On November 1st, 1989, test pilot Viktor Pugachev became the first Soviet pilot to land conventionally on the deck of a Soviet aircraft carrier when his Su-27K caught the wire across the deck. Later that very day, the MiG-29K also landed aboard the carrier for the first time, and both aircraft undertook successful launches, proving that their system was successful. Nevertheless, the Soviets were still obliged to not refer to them as carriers due to their treaty with Turkey regarding passage through the Turkish Straits. Thus, despite obviously being a carrier in every way, the Tbilisi was once again classified as a heavy aircraft cruiser, and no complaint has ever been filed with Moscow for the ship eventually sailing through the Straits. Once again, the old Soviet mindset of heavily arming carriers prevailed, and the ship was armed with 12 P-700 Granite supersonic anti-ship missiles, as well as a multi-layered anti-aircraft defense system comprising of surface-to-air missiles and guns. Anti-submarine duties were carried out by Kamov Kar-27s, an evolution of the earlier Kar-25s, while the development of the helicopter, dubbed the Kar-31, featured a large radar under the fuselage for detecting hostile aircraft and missiles at long range, and then guiding the ship's fighters to intercept them. Work had begun on a second ship in 1985, and this vessel inherited the name Riga from the earlier ship, only to end up being renamed Varyag. Yet after 70 years of Soviet admirals dreaming of possessing a true operational aircraft carrier, it was not to be. Between 1989 and 1991, the Soviet Union began to collapse, until it ceased being on December 26, 1991. Varyag was left incomplete, while Tbilisi, renamed for the last time as the Admiral Kuznetsov, had to leave port in the now independent Ukraine in order to join the newly reconstituted Russian Navy's Northern Fleet. Its crew and air wing partially depleted as non-Russians chose to join their newly independent nations. The two Moskva-class helicopter carriers and the 4 Kiev-class aviation cruisers were soon confined to their ports, some never leaving again except to be scrapped. Demonstrating the New World Order, the Yakovlev Design Bureau actually worked with the American company Lockheed to further develop the Yak-41M as the Yak-141, but this failed to come to fruition. However, accusations have been made that the aircraft did influence Lockheed's X-35 project, which became the F-35B Lightning Bolt II aircraft, used by the US Marines and the UK, and achieves VTOL using a similar principle. As for the Kuznetsov, funds to continue construction only trickled in until it began to operate aircraft regularly in 1993. The Russian Navy dropped support for the MiG-29K and instead focused on the Su-27K, which was redesignated as the Su-33 to distinguish it from its land-based forebear. The Russian Navy claimed that the Su-33 had much greater development potential, even though most observers agreed the MiG-29K was better suited to multi-role operations, and was easier to store on a carrier, being smaller in size. Mikoyan made allegations that their aircraft was rejected because of the political influence of Sukhoi, and so continued development without government support, albeit slowly, a decision that would later bear results. Few ships in the world can claim to have had such a bad run of luck as the Kuznetsov. Throughout the 1990s, the carrier seldom went to sea. The ship suffered from repeated breakdowns, which Moscow was either unable or unwilling to repair, and consequently, the number of new pilots who were qualified on carrier operations dropped. It was not helped that some of the training facilities built in the Soviet era were now located in foreign countries. For this reason, qualified pilots were retained in service for much longer than their American counterparts, with the average age of carrier-experienced pilots in the Russian Navy during the early 2000s nearing 40 years old in some periods. A planned deployment in 2000 was abandoned after the Kursk submarine disaster, so that the carrier could assist in its rescue efforts. The carrier was able to go to sea in 2004 and 2005 for naval exercises, during the latter of which a Su-33 fell off the carrier's deck. After this, a modernization program was undertaken, and December 2007, it undertook a cruise in the Mediterranean Sea, which required it to sail in close proximity to North Sea oil rigs, forcing Norway to stop helicopter flights to the rigs because of the fear of collision with Kuznetsov's aircraft. In 2009, the ship undertook a disastrous cruise where a sailor was killed by carbon monoxide poisoning, while the British and Irish governments were alarmed by the pollution left south of Ireland after the ship and its escorts undertook a refueling operation. Into the 2010s, the Kuznetsov continued to go to sea again and again, and then return home for extensive repairs for whatever had broken during the cruise. Confidence in its reliability had now deteriorated to such an extent that the carrier never left port without at least one tugboat alongside in case its engines had failed. Meanwhile, the Indian Navy began looking at the MiG-29K as a suitable aircraft for its own carrier program, and this prompted the Russian Navy to reconsider this type for their service. Then in 2016, the Kuznetsov undertook its first combat cruise to Syria to support President Bashar al-Assad's government. Its air wing was now a hybrid of Su-33s and multi-role MiG-29Ks, one of each of which would be lost during the whole operation, a MiG-29K crashed attempting to take off, while a Su-33 again crashed attempting to land. Nevertheless, the carrier conducted 420 combat missions in support of the Syrian regime by the time it returned to Russia in 2017. The combat cruise, despite its problems, represents something of a high point for the carrier's career. On April 30th, 2018, the floating dry dock used to maintain the carrier sank, damaging the ship and killing a crew worker. Then in December 2019, the ship was significantly damaged by a major fire, which killed 2 and injured 14 others. Another fire broke out in December 2022, while repairs from the previous incidents were still underway. Yet despite all of this, Russian President Vladimir Putin seems determined to keep the ship in service, if for no other reason than to give Russia the appearance of being in the carrier club of nations. At present, the Kuznetsov is planned to remain in service until 2040, something that many Western analysts have said won't be achieved by anything short of a miracle. Already its planned refit and modernization is way behind schedule, as the Russian government has withheld funds to finish it, despite insisting that it will be completed. On February 21st, 2023, the Russian state-owned United Shipbuilding Corporation announced that the Kuznetsov had finally been towed out of dry dock and is afloat once more, in what is a rare piece of good news for the story of this much maligned ship. There is a positive caveat to this tale of carrier woe, however. Both China and India have reaped the benefits of the Soviet programs, and now have their own carrier programs in place as a result. India acquired the Kiev-class ship Admiral Kuzentsov in 2004, and undertook a major rebuild which saw it stripped of its armament and replaced by a stow bar system similar to that aboard the Kuznetsov, including a ski jump on the bow. Renamed the INS Vikramaditya, the ship entered service in 2014 and operates MiG-29Ks, although in 2020 it conducted the first trials of a navalized variant of the Indian HAL Tejas light combat aircraft. Experience gained with the vessel helped in development of the INS Vikrant, the first carrier to be built in India, and which clearly shows its Soviet influence in its concept. China also acquired 2 Kiev-class ships, the Kiev itself becoming a floating hotel and theme park, while the Minsk has become a museum ship. In 1998, the unfinished hull of Varyag was sold by Ukraine, where it had been deteriorating since the collapse of the Soviet Union, to a Chinese travel agency for it to also be turned into a floating hotel and casino. After a rather eventful journey under tow, it arrived in China in February 2002 and was berthed at the Dalian Naval Shipyard, where the real purpose of acquiring the ship was revealed. At considerable cost, the Varyag was overhauled and completed as China's first aircraft carrier, the Liaoning, and provided the genesis for China's second carrier, the Shandong. Both ships have given the Chinese Navy a formidable global power projection capability, which Soviet admirals had once dreamed about for decades, but were always just out of reach of. The modern Chinese and Indian carrier forces have become the beneficiaries of the Soviet drive to take air power to sea, thus offering a glimpse of just what might have been had the Soviet leadership taken a greater interest in carrier aviation sooner.